Imagine the scene. It's 6:15 in the morning, and I am standing on my family's 40-acre farm in Montana. Vapor curls up from my coffee cup as I observe the sunrise casting a golden hue on the mountains. My phone vibrates. A voice on the line identifies itself as 911 dispatch. We have a report that you are trespassing on private property and must vacate the premises immediately. A genuine laugh escaped me. Seriously, how would you react if you were reported to the police for being on land that has been in your family for 80 years? I reached for my leather badge wallet. Ma'am, please inform whoever called that Deputy Sheriff Ezra Blackwood is precisely where he is supposed to be. Through the window of my neighbor's McMansion, I saw Karen Peton's face turn as pale as newly fallen snow. She still had expensive binoculars glued to her eyes like some sort of neighborhood operative. The scent of hay and diesel mingled with the dawn fog, and I had a feeling things were on the verge of becoming compelling. Let me rewind and explain how this entire situation began. I'm Ezra Blackwood, age 45. Following a 15-year career as a deputy sheriff and a difficult divorce last spring, I returned to the family farm I inherited from my grandfather. It's 40 acres of unadulterated Montana splendor that has been in our family since 1943, when Grandpa Jeremiah purchased it using his GI Bill funds after the war. The old barn still carries the scent of machine oil and decades of hard, honest labor. It's the kind of place where I was taught to repair tractors at the age of 8 and imagined I would live out my days in tranquility. Then, 5 years ago, Willowbrook Estates was constructed right up to my property line. 47 McMansions complete with identical mailboxes and seasonal decorative banners. For the most part, the residents were excellent neighbors who enjoyed purchasing fresh vegetables from my small farm stand and letting their children feed Buttercup, my goat. Yes, her name is Buttercup. Reserve your judgment. But then there was the exception. Karen Peton, 52 years old, with expensively maintained bottle blonde hair that had a monthly cost exceeding that of many vehicle loans. She possessed a PhD in art history that she referenced at every opportunity and an attitude befitting someone who equated studying Renaissance art with graduating from Harvard Law. Her husband, Braden, was the owner of Peton Construction, the firm that developed Willowbrook, and they resided in the largest home with a lawn so immaculate it likely consumed more water than my whole vegetable plot. The problems commenced on a Tuesday morning in June when I heard the distinct click-clack of costly heels on my gravel drive. Karen strode over my property line, clutching a manila folder as thick as a phone book. The overwhelming floral fragrance she wore was so strong it caused my chickens to halt their pecking and look up. "Mr. Blackwood," she declared, using that condescending tone that sets your teeth on edge, "I am here on official HOA business." I wiped my hands on my denim jeans. "Ma'am, I was not under the impression that I was a member of your HOA." Her laugh was like a car engine struggling to turn over in the cold. "Oh, but you are now. When Willowbrook Estates was incorporated, your land was grandfathered into our covenants." She shoved a certified letter at me as if it were a court summons. "You were given 30 days to bring this agricultural situation into compliance." The legal terminology made my head spin, but the stipulations were abundantly clear. Dismantle the barn, take down the chicken coop, get rid of the vegetable stand, and move all unsightly farm machinery. The most outrageous part was the threat of a $500 daily fine if I failed to comply. The taste of my morning coffee became acrid as Karen stood there, arms folded, with a smug expression as if she had just outmaneuvered Bobby Fischer in a chess match. "Property values in our community are contingent on upholding certain aesthetic standards," she went on. But I observed something peculiar. She repeatedly glanced toward my property with a covetous look, as if she were appraising it for something much larger than HOA conformity. "Your charming little hobby farm may appear quaint, but it is costing each of us thousands in resale value." Here is what was inconsistent. The majority of Willowbrook residents were actually supportive of me. They would visit the farm stand, allow their children to pet Buttercup, and comment on how wonderful it was to have a slice of authentic country life nearby. Yet Karen had managed to assemble a small group who believed my farm was devaluing their suburban utopia, and she had already threatened legal action if the town council failed to enforce her interpretation of community standards. That evening, as I sat on my porch listening to Buttercup munch on grass, and watching the final rays of light disappear behind the mountains, I came to a realization. This wasn't merely about HOA regulations or aesthetic criteria. It was about Karen's gaze when she surveyed my 40 acres, her husband's construction business, that avaricious expression. This was a matter of power, control, and land that someone desired for reasons they had yet to disclose. The sound of her designer heels on the gravel still resonated in my mind, and I had a strong intuition that a woman who would dial 911 on a deputy sheriff on his own family property would not be content with just a sternly worded letter. Karen wasted no time in escalating the matter. 3 days after presenting her ultimatum, she lodged a formal complaint with the county zoning board, alleging that my farm was a public health risk due to animal waste and the attraction of rodents. She circulated a petition among the residents of Willowbrook, securing 12 signatures from the 47 households. While not a massive wave of support, she displayed these signatures on the neighborhood's Facebook page as if she had achieved a resounding electoral victory. The photograph she posted made my tidy, well-kept farm appear to be some sort of rural catastrophe, all taken from strange perspectives that made my chicken coop resemble a condemned structure. However, this is where Karen made her first significant error. She had never actually reviewed the HOA's original incorporation documents. You see, 15 years in law enforcement teaches you that most individuals presume someone else has done the necessary research, and Karen was counting on that assumption. Consequently, I drove to the county courthouse and asked for every document pertaining to the formation of Willowbrook Estates. The aroma of old paper and institutional coffee pervaded the records room as I laid out the yellowed documents on a metal table, recalling a phrase my training sergeant often used. The devil is always in the details, and lawyers delight in hiding devils. It was then that I discovered it. Tucked away in subsection 12C of the original incorporation agreement was a clause declaring that existing agricultural operations shall be permanently exempt from all aesthetic and operational restrictions. Permanently exempt. Those two magnificent words signified that Karen's entire legal argument was founded on a precarious base, and I eagerly anticipated watching her sink. I opted to challenge her bluff regarding public health risks by requesting an inspection from the county health department myself. The inspector, a no-nonsense woman named Janet who had been inspecting farms for 20 years, arrived on a Thursday morning. She inspected every part of my property, took soil samples, studied the chicken coop with a magnifying glass, and even inspected Buttercup's hooves for any sign of disease. Upon finishing, Janet actually chuckled. "Mr. Blackwood, this farm surpasses organic certification criteria. I have inspected million-dollar operations that are not this well-maintained." The feeling of vindication was more satisfying than my grandmother's apple pie. While I was constructing my legal defense, a curious event took place. Karen's husband, Braden, cautiously approached me one evening as I was securing the farm stand for the night. He seemed anxious, repeatedly looking back at his house as if Karen might be observing him. "Ezra," he started, his voice barely a whisper, "what would it take for you to sell this land?" He continued, "I'm offering 40% above the market rate. A cash transaction. We will take care of all the legal formalities." 40% above market value for a property that was allegedly diminishing everyone's home prices? That seemed remarkably generous. The details began to align like cartridges being loaded into a shotgun. A lesson from my detective training came to mind. When individuals' actions do not align with their declared motives, trace the money. This was not about appearances or property values. Karen and Braden coveted my land for a particular purpose, and they were prepared to offer a premium to acquire it. "I appreciate the offer," I said to Braden, "but this farm is not for sale at any price." His expression fell as if he had anticipated that response, but had been hoping for a different one. "Look, just between us, Karen gets these notions in her head, and once she has committed to a course of action." He let his sentence trail off, but the implied warning was unmistakable. The community's response was both swift and firm. The local newspaper published an article headlined, "Deputies Farm Under HOA Fire," and soon, neighboring farmers were stopping by to express their support. 3 families from Willowbrook publicly retracted their signatures from Karen's petition, with one of them posting on Facebook, "We signed before we understood the full situation." The Blackwood farm is precisely what makes this community special. My law enforcement instincts took over completely, and I began to handle this situation as I would any criminal inquiry. Every interaction with Karen was documented. Every conversation was recorded. Montana's status as a one-party consent state was a tool I had utilized in domestic violence cases, and it was equally applicable to HOA harassment. Every piece of correspondence was filed and duplicated, as I had seen too many cases collapse due to missing paperwork. Karen's reaction to the loss of community backing was predictable. She grew louder and more frantic. She began to post daily updates on social media about the ongoing agricultural crisis in Willowbrook, accompanied by photographs taken with telephoto lenses that made me feel as if I were under surveillance. The sound of her heels on my gravel driveway became as predictable as the morning roosters crow, and each visit brought fresh complaints, new threats, and new demands that became progressively more ridiculous. But something wonderful was also transpiring. The three families who had withdrawn their support became regular patrons of my farm stand, bringing along friends and neighbors who had never been before. News was spreading beyond Willowbrook about a local farm where one could find the county's best tomatoes and allow their children to see where food originates, all while supporting a deputy sheriff who was standing firm against a bully. By the conclusion of that first month, I understood that Karen had made a significant strategic mistake. Instead of keeping the matter private and resolving it through behind-the-scenes negotiations, she had made it a public spectacle. In a community that prized honesty, diligence, and confronting bullies, she had chosen the wrong battle with the wrong person. Karen's desperation was becoming apparent, and desperate individuals are prone to making foolish errors. 2 weeks after her initial defeat, she filed a fabricated police report alleging that I had threatened her with physical harm. I was on duty when the call was received, and my sergeant gave me the look that police officers get when paperwork seems nonsensical. Blackwood, Karen Peton claims you threatened to deal with her permanently during your last talk. Would you like to clarify? I took out my phone and presented the body camera footage I had been recording since the beginning of this ordeal. The video showed Karen doing 90% of the shouting while I stood with my arms folded, politely requesting that she exit my property. The closest thing to a threat was my statement that I would deal with this through proper legal channels, which Karen, in her agitated state, had apparently interpreted as a death threat. My sergeant simply shook his head and placed the complaint in what we refer to as the crazy neighbor folder. That same afternoon, Animal Control arrived at my property following Karen's report of dangerous livestock posing a threat to public safety. The officer observed my 3 chickens pecking contentedly in their coop and Buttercup chewing grass near the fence. He then turned to me with the expression people have when they realize they've been the victim of a prank. She claimed you had aggressive farm animals. I was anticipating something with fangs, not a goat that is attempting to befriend my boot. His official report stated that my livestock were exceptionally well socialized and presented no threat to public safety. But Karen's piece de resistance was yet to come. She began to park her BMW squarely in front of my farm stand's entrance during its busiest times, asserting that she was monitoring traffic safety. The very woman who complained about excessive traffic was now deliberately causing a traffic jam. My security cameras documented everything. Karen in her luxury vehicle with a clipboard, noting down the license plates of customers as if she were some kind of suburban secret agent, and periodically stepping out to admonish families for supporting agricultural nuisances that threaten property values. Here is something I learned from 15 years of handling domestic conflicts. Documentation is always more effective than confrontation. Rather than engaging in the shouting match Karen desired, I submitted harassment and obstruction complaints, complete with timestamped photographs and video footage. Each interaction was recorded, and every incident was reported, creating a paper trail that would simplify any prosecutor's task. The great thing about Karen's false police report was watching it backfire so dramatically. My fellow deputies began to jest about my dangerous farming operation, and the sheriff himself made a point of visiting to purchase tomatoes, remarking loudly on how serene and well-run everything appeared. When Karen contacted dispatch the following week to report me for aggressively fertilizing at 6 a.m., they actually put her on hold before gently informing her that farming is not a criminal offense. While Karen was busy undermining her own credibility, I was delving deeper into public records, driven by that persistent feeling about Braden's generous cash offer. What I discovered at the county planning office made everything perfectly clear. Preliminary development sketches for a luxury subdivision expansion that encompassed my 40 acres, filed 6 months prior to Karen's initial complaint. This was not a random case of HOA harassment. It was a deliberate business tactic to compel me to leave the land they required for their next development. The community's response was everything I could have wished for. When news of Karen's obstructionist tactics spread, 3 local veterans started volunteering as unofficial customer service representatives, setting up lawn chairs and coffee thermoses to guarantee that people could reach my driveway. They were not there to cause intimidation, but to offer a friendly presence that coincidentally made Karen feel extremely ill at ease. My favorite instance was when Mrs. Patterson from Willowbrook, a retired schoolteacher with no patience for nonsense, approached Karen's BMW during one of her surveillance periods. "Excuse me, dear," she said in the tone teachers reserve for unruly children, "but you are obstructing access to the finest tomatoes in 3 counties. Either make a purchase or move your vehicle." The expression on Karen's face when she understood that even her own neighbors were now against her was worth every moment of harassment I had experienced. The ironic outcome of Karen's campaign was the transformation of my modest farm operation into the county's most frequented weekend spot. People traveled from adjacent towns specifically to purchase vegetables from that deputy sheriff who's standing up to the HOA bullies. What began as Karen's attempt to ruin my business had evolved into the most effective marketing effort I could have imagined. But I was aware this was merely the start. Karen's behavior was becoming more unpredictable and more frantic, and individuals with nothing to lose are inclined to make even greater errors. The question was not if she would escalate again, but how far she would push before she went beyond a point of no return. The scent of diesel from my tractor blending with her costly perfume during our encounters was becoming as routine as my morning coffee, and I had an inkling that both smells would be lingering for some time. Karen was finished with minor skirmishes. By the 3rd month, she had retained Harrison Kemp, a high-priced lawyer from the state capitol who commanded a fee of $500 per hour and specialized in what he termed property value protection. Their ultimate strategy was a civil lawsuit alleging that my farm had led to a $200,000 decrease in property values throughout Willowbrook Estates, seeking an emergency injunction to halt all farming activities at once. The lawsuit was a professionally executed form of intimidation aimed at overwhelming me with legal expenses until I capitulated and sold. What Kemp was unaware of was that I had been assembling my own legal support. My former partner, Sarah, now a prosecutor, was providing me with information on his firm's methods. "Ezra," she informed me over coffee, "this man has employed the same strategy in 4 other counties. He relies on people being unable to finance the legal battle. But I could afford the fight because I possessed something more valuable than money. I had extensive documentation and a growing belief that this whole affair was larger than just one difficult neighbor. My detective's intuition was screaming that Karen's frantic behavior was not solely about property values. So, I began to trace the financial trail, just as I had been taught to do when tracking down drug traffickers. What I uncovered changed the entire situation. Peton Construction had employed nearly identical harassment strategies against 3 other rural landowners in adjacent counties over the previous 5 years. The methodology was consistent. Target properties next to potential development sites, apply HOA pressure to compel sales at below-market prices, and then transfer the land to shell corporations for substantial gains. Each of the victims had ultimately sold their family land for a small part of its development potential. The district attorney's office showed great interest in this pattern. They had been receiving complaints about Peton Construction's business conduct, but had not made the connection until I presented them with 5 years of documented harassment incidents. "This is more than just neighbor disagreements," the DA stated, laying out my findings on her conference table. "This is systematic fraud with a clear paper trail." While I was constructing a criminal case, Karen was engineering her own demise. Her conduct had grown progressively erratic. Midnight inspections of the property line, taking photographs of my customers' license plates, and lodging complaints about everything from excessive chicken noises to threatening vegetable arrangements. The woman was unwittingly documenting her own harassment campaign. Her most significant blunder occurred when she attempted to bribe County Building Inspector Bob Martinez to declare my barn structurally unsound. Bob had inspected that barn twice in 5 years and knew it was robust. So, when Karen passed an envelope across a coffee shop table, he promptly contacted the sheriff's department. She offered me $2,000 in cash to invent violations that are not there, Bob reported. I have encountered some desperate individuals, but this woman has lost her senses. The bribery attempt was Karen's first verifiable felony, but my prosecutor friend Sarah persuaded me to delay any arrests. Let her continue to dig, Sarah recommended. Every action she takes provides us with more evidence, and desperate people make even bigger mistakes. The community's reaction had surpassed my most optimistic hopes. Local veterans started organizing weekend farm support rallies, encouraging families to buy produce and demonstrate solidarity against intimidation. The County Fair Committee invited me to speak on the topic of preserving agricultural heritage in developing areas. 3 neighboring counties reached out to me regarding similar harassment cases, transforming my individual struggle into a regional cause for rural property rights. But the true turning point arrived when Karen made her decisive mistake. Believing she was on the verge of losing everything, she began to circulate rumors that I was selling drugs from my farm stand and filed false police reports alleging she had observed suspicious late-night activities involving unknown vehicles and exchange of packages. She was describing people purchasing vegetables after their workday, but her reports were grave enough to initiate a DEA investigation. When federal agents arrived at my farm, they discovered precisely what they anticipated: an off-duty deputy sheriff cultivating organic tomatoes and keeping chickens. What they did not anticipate was a comprehensive file of evidence demonstrating systematic harassment by a woman who had now submitted false reports to numerous agencies. The lead agent, a no-nonsense woman named Detective Riley, examined my documentation and shook her head. "Deputy, you have sufficient evidence here for federal fraud charges. This is no longer a neighbor dispute. This is organized criminal activity." That evening, as I sat on my porch with Buttercup grazing nearby, I realized that Karen had ventured from civil harassment into the realm of federal crime. The taste of the evening air, mingled with the aroma of ripening tomatoes, felt like liberation because I knew this ordeal was nearing its end. Karen's expensive attorney was already trying to distance himself from her more extreme actions, and even Braden was discreetly making calls about managing the damage. But Karen was too far gone to see defeat. Her final desperate move was already taking shape in her mind, and I could discern it in the way she watched my property from her window, like a general plotting one last, desperate battle she could not afford to lose. 3 months into this ordeal, I made a discovery that altered the entire situation. I was in the county law library, researching HOA precedents, when a thought began to bother me. Why had Karen's lawyer failed to present the actual incorporation documents during their lawsuit? Every legitimate organization has those papers readily available. So, I chose to retrieve Willowbrook Estates' complete filing history myself, requesting every document mandated by Montana state law. What I discovered in that musty government folder made my hands tremble. Karen Peton had never legally formed the HOA, not even remotely. The manila envelope should have held incorporation papers filed with the Secretary of State, registration numbers, compulsory insurance bonds, and state-mandated financial oversight protocols. Instead, I found only a few pages of neighborhood meeting minutes and a photocopied template from a website. For 5 years, Karen had been levying dues and imposing fines through what was essentially a book club with grandiose delusions. But the true revelation came when I subpoenaed the financial records through the DA's office. Every cent of the collected HOA funds, totaling over $300,000, was deposited in a personal checking account under the name K. Peton, Administrator. There was no separate business entity, no board supervision, no audit trail, just Karen's private bank account, sustained by her neighbors' monthly contributions. The bank statements were like exhibits in a fraud trial. A luxury vacation to Europe listed as an HOA conference, her BMW payments categorized as administrative costs, and their swimming pool renovation invoiced as a community improvement project. Karen had been treating the HOA funds as her personal slush fund for half a decade, certain that no one would ever challenge her authority enough to find out she possessed none. I sat there, encircled by proof of systematic embezzlement, at last comprehending why Karen had battled so fiercely against any form of scrutiny. This was not about property values or suburban aesthetics. It was about safeguarding a criminal operation that had financed her lifestyle from the very beginning. Every fabricated police report, every campaign of harassment, every desperate effort to ruin my farm had been Karen's attempt to avert this very moment. The legal ramifications struck me with the force of a freight train. Managing a fraudulent corporation while soliciting money under false pretenses results in federal charges: wire fraud, tax evasion, embezzlement. Karen was facing significant prison time. The IRS consequences alone could ruin her family, even without a criminal conviction. Here lies the beautiful irony. Every single resident of Willowbrook could now demand a complete refund of every cent they had ever paid, as they had been the targets of an elaborate financial con. Every fine Karen had levied was fraudulent. Every assessment notice was sent without any legal standing. She had been operating a neighborhood protection scheme and passing it off as community management. When I contacted Sarah at the prosecutor's office, her response was exactly what I had wished for. "Ezra, this is a prosecutor's dream come true. We have 5 years of documented fraud with a clear paper trail that points directly to Karen's personal bank account. She was so self-assured in her authority that she never troubled herself to make it legitimate." But this revelation also accounted for Braden's growing anxiety. He was aware that his wife was sitting on a financial ticking bomb that could demolish everything they had constructed. The construction company, their political ties, their lavish lifestyle, all of it relied on the smooth operation of Karen's sham empire and no one asking too many questions. Now I saw why Karen had escalated the situation so severely. Any challenge to her authority posed a threat to uncovering the entire fraudulent scheme. She could not retreat, because retreating meant financial ruin and a federal prison sentence. The prospect of justice was gratifying, but I knew this was only the start. Karen was on the verge of learning that you cannot build a kingdom on a foundation of lies indefinitely. And when such a kingdom collapses, it brings down everything with it. The morning following my discovery, I entered District Attorney Sarah Hawthorne's office carrying 5 boxes of evidence and a strategy that was set to turn Karen's world completely on its head. Sarah laid out the financial documents on her conference table, shaking her head as she examined bank records that detailed Karen's personal shopping excursions financed by her neighbors' contributions. "Ezra," she said, "this is no longer just harassment. Your neighbor has been operating a criminal organization under the guise of community management." The charges were piling up like groceries on a list: embezzlement, fraud, filing false police reports, attempted bribery, and tax evasion. Because Karen had utilized electronic payments and the postal service to collect fraudulent dues, we could also include federal wire and mail fraud charges, which come with substantial prison sentences. The brilliant part, Sarah noted, is that she documented everything herself. Most offenders attempt to conceal their tracks. Karen framed hers and displayed it. However, we needed more than just charges. We needed a plan that would publicly reveal Karen's offenses while safeguarding the very community she had been exploiting. It was then that I recalled something from my time on patrol. Sometimes the most effective way to apprehend a criminal is to let them believe they are on the brink of victory right up until the moment the handcuffs are secured. The technical groundwork was simple. Montana's one-party consent law ensured that every recorded conversation with Karen would be admissible in court. The state statutes on corporation fraud mandated full restitution to the victims, and the funds were still in Karen's personal account, like a telltale sign of guilt. Most critically, because she had never legally established the HOA, every official act she had performed over the past 5 years was illegitimate. I began to rally community support, but with caution. Judge Patricia Morrison, recently retired and a resident near Willowbrook, had been observing Karen's behavior with a professional eye. "Ezra," she said to me over coffee, "I've handled organized crime cases with less evidence than what that woman has generated." She was so certain of her authority that she never stopped to consider she didn't possess any. The veterans who had been assisting at my farm became my evidence-gathering team. We compiled 5 years of financial statements, letters, and witness accounts, creating a case file that would delight federal prosecutors. My colleague Mike from the Sheriff's Department facilitated coordination with state investigators who had been observing similar fraudulent activities across Montana. But this is where the strategy became particularly clever. Instead of arresting Karen right away, we chose to let her continue to entrap herself. She is unaware that we have uncovered the financial fraud, Sarah pointed out. Every day she continues to operate her sham HOA. She commits new offenses. Every threat, every fine, every official-looking document adds to the list of charges in the eventual indictment. The residents of Willowbrook were beginning to understand that they had rights they were previously unaware of. When it became known that they could legally cease paying dues to an unregistered entity, 43 households immediately halted their payments. Even better, they could seek full reimbursement for everything they had ever paid, money that was still traceable in Karen's personal accounts. The timing needed to be impeccable. Karen had organized what she termed a mandatory emergency meeting for all residents, where she intended to unveil new enforcement policies and higher fines. She had distributed official-looking circulars threatening legal repercussions for non-attendance, complete with her counterfeit letterhead and false claims of authority. The irony was exquisite. She was in the process of committing new crimes while intending to accuse me of misconduct. I arranged with the local media, who had been tracking the story. Channel 7's investigative unit saw this as a prime example of HOA overreach and wanted to capture Karen's downfall as it happened. If we execute this perfectly, explained reporter Janet Walsh, her counterfeit meeting will become her public admission of guilt on live television. The psychological upper hand was crucial. Karen was still under the impression that she was prevailing. Her high-priced lawyer had discreetly stepped away, but she was representing herself with the self-assurance of someone who believed legal authority was derived from speaking loudly and brandishing official-looking documents. She had been promoting her meeting as the final solution to the agricultural problem, promising to unveil shocking evidence of my alleged corruption. My final arrangements were straightforward yet vital. I made sure that backup deputies were stationed around the community center, not for security, but to stop Karen from escaping when the truth came out. Detective Riley from the State Fraud Division would be in attendance with federal arrest warrants, and the bank had already put a freeze on Karen's accounts pending the investigation. The perfect trap was that Karen's own desperation had set the stage. She had called her fraudulent meeting to assert an authority she never had, intending to intimidate people with laws that were not applicable, all while federal investigators recorded every fraudulent statement. Sometimes, justice is not about seeking revenge. It is about providing criminals with enough rope to hang themselves. That evening, as I sat on my porch with Buttercup grazing peacefully, I felt a sense of calm that had eluded me for months. The scent of ripening tomatoes filled the mountain air, and for the first time since this ordeal began, I could see the end in sight. Karen Peton was about to learn the most difficult lesson of her privileged existence. Genuine authority cannot be fabricated, and stolen money must always be returned. Karen's world was caving in, and desperate people take desperate measures. With the majority of Willowbrook residents withholding dues and her authority disintegrating, she opted to confront the root of her issues directly, my farm. The escalation began subtly, but rapidly intensified beyond anything I would have anticipated from a suburban mother with a doctorate in art history. It started with sabotage efforts that were more comical than effective. My security footage captured Karen at 2:30 a.m., clad in dark attire, attempting to vandalize my irrigation system with a crowbar she clearly did not know how to handle. She struggled with a water valve for 20 minutes before conceding defeat and resorting to unscrewing the tops of my fertilizer bags, haphazardly scattering organic nutrients across my fields. The irony was flawless. Even her acts of sabotage inadvertently benefited my crops. However, Karen's desperation pushed her into more dangerous actions. A week later, she tried to jeopardize my organic certification by applying commercial herbicide near my crops, aiming for inspectors to discover chemical traces and withdraw my licenses. What she failed to consider was that she had chosen the most blustery day of the month for her chemical attack. The majority of the herbicide was blown back onto her own immaculate lawn, while my carefully arranged gardens were barely touched. My cameras recorded her hurried departure as she grasped that she had poisoned her own turf. The real intensification occurred with a fresh wave of fabricated police reports, but these were far more perilous than her earlier complaints. Karen began dialing 911, asserting that she had seen drug transactions at my farm stand, portraying normal vegetable purchases as suspicious exchanges of packages. She submitted elaborate reports detailing late-night criminal activities that involved unmarked vehicles and large cash transactions, effectively criminalizing families who visited after work to buy produce. These false claims prompted a DEA investigation that could have jeopardized my law enforcement career. When federal agents arrived, expecting to find a drug ring but instead found an off-duty deputy cultivating tomatoes, they were far from pleased. Agent Sarah Martinez went over Karen's 17 false reports submitted to 5 different agencies and shook her head. Deputy Blackwood, this is no longer a case of neighborly harassment. This constitutes a systematic obstruction of justice, and we will be adding federal charges. Karen's desperation reached its zenith when she attempted to bribe County Building Inspector Bob Martinez to declare my barn structurally unsound. She arranged a meeting with him at Murphy's Diner, sliding an envelope with $2,000 across the table while asserting that my barn presented immediate safety hazards requiring urgent action. Bob, a 30-year veteran who had inspected that very barn twice and knew it was structurally sound, immediately informed on the attempted bribery. She wanted me to invent violations, he conveyed to my captain. That's not just unethical. That's asking me to endanger lives for her own personal agenda. But the bribery attempt provided us with precisely what we needed, a demonstrable felony with both witnesses and physical evidence. Sarah at the DA's office was prepared to make an arrest, but I persuaded her to hold off. She's digging her own grave faster than we can keep track, I contended. Every frantic action she takes adds more years to her potential sentence. The community observed Karen's public deterioration with increasing concern. She began to accost my customers directly, yelling about property values and questioning why they were patronizing criminal enterprises. When she cornered the elderly Mrs. Bennett as she was purchasing tomatoes for her grandchildren, several onlookers reported it as harassment. Mrs. Bennett, a retired federal agent who had dealt with actual criminals, informed Karen that she was making a fool of herself and everyone in her vicinity. Local shops started to deny Karen's service after she berated a young grocery store employee for carrying my produce. The coffee shop downtown displayed a tactful notice. We support all local agricultural businesses and request that customers treat one another with respect. In other words, Karen was not welcome if she could not conduct herself in a civilized manner. Karen's social media activity became a live feed of her psychological decline. Her posts became progressively more paranoid, depicting my tranquil farm as a criminal hub with suspicious activities that endangered the community. She posted grainy photos taken from her bathroom window, attempting to cast a sinister light on ordinary farm tasks. The posts were widely circulated, but as illustrations of HOA power abuse rather than as endorsements of her cause. The final escalation occurred when Karen used social media to appeal to concerned citizens to assist her in conducting surveillance operations to collect evidence of my illegal activities. She advised people to bring cameras and whatever else might be necessary to record the threat my farm posed to public safety. The sheriff's department interpreted this as a potential threat and temporarily seized her firearms while awaiting a mental health assessment. By the 4th month, Karen had morphed from an irritating neighbor into a federal offender, amassing enough evidence for the prosecution of a dozen individuals. Her desperation had propelled her beyond minor harassment into the realm of serious felonies, all while I observed and meticulously recorded each offense. The mountain air smelled of impending justice as I watched her dismantle her own life, one false report at a time. Karen's last month before her downfall was characterized by increasingly frantic actions that revealed a woman aware of her entrapment but unable to cease her struggle. With the majority of Willowbrook residents withholding their dues and federal authorities probing her finances, she initiated what she termed her evidence-gathering campaign to definitively establish that I was the true offender. Her initial step was to hire a private investigator, Marcus Webb, to professionally monitor my farm's activities. Karen offered him $5,000 to uncover proof of illicit operations, certain that a genuine detective would corroborate her long-standing claims. Webb accepted the assignment, spent 3 days observing my daily farm routines, and then contacted the sheriff's department. Deputy Blackwood, he informed my captain, This woman engaged me to find crimes that do not exist. When I informed her that your activities were entirely lawful, she offered an additional $5,000 to create false evidence. The attempt to bribe a licensed investigator was yet another felony to add to Karen's expanding record, but it also signified something vital. She was depleting her financial resources. Bank statements would later confirm that she had drained her retirement funds and taken out a loan against her house to finance her campaign against my farm. The woman who had been subsisting on misappropriated HOA funds was now driving herself into bankruptcy in an effort to ruin the person who had uncovered her misdeeds. Karen's desperation prompted more direct measures. She began mailing certified letters to my regular patrons, cautioning them that buying from my farm made them complicit in criminal acts and threatening to inform law enforcement of their participation. The letters were printed on her counterfeit HOA stationery, filled with official-sounding jargon about community safety protocols and mandatory reporting requirements. What she failed to grasp was that menacing witnesses in a federal probe is considered witness tampering, another felony charge for her accumulating list. However, the letters completely misfired. Instead of deterring customers, they united people against Karen's progressively erratic conduct. Mrs. Patterson organized what she dubbed a Freedom to Buy Vegetables rally at my farm stand, gathering 30 neighbors to demonstrate their solidarity. This woman believes she can intimidate us for choosing where to shop, Mrs. Patterson declared. Well, I've been purchasing tomatoes for longer than she's been on this earth, and I'll be damned if some HOA tyrant is going to dictate where I spend my money. Karen's subsequent escalation involved lodging a voluminous complaint with the state agriculture department, asserting that my farm was in breach of organic certification regulations and presented environmental risks. She provided a 40-page report, including soil samples she had unlawfully taken during her trespassing and photographs from her surveillance efforts. The state inspector who examined her complaint later described it as the most meticulously documented case of harassment disguised as environmental concern he had seen in 20 years. The Agriculture Department's investigation exonerated my farm of all accusations and, in fact, nominated me for the state's Sustainable Agriculture Excellence Award. Karen's pilfered soil samples demonstrated that my organic practices surpassed the necessary standards. Once again, her own evidence served as my defense, and the inspector's report would become another piece of evidence in her eventual trial. Realizing that official avenues were not yielding results, Karen made her most desperate move yet. She attempted to rally neighboring HOAs into what she dubbed a regional agricultural resistance coalition. She reached out to HOA presidents in 3 counties, alerting them to the perilous precedent set by my farm and calling for unified action before similar agricultural invasions could endanger their communities. Every HOA president she contacted then passed her correspondence on to law enforcement as proof of a potential conspiracy to harass rural landowners. But while Karen was preoccupied with self-destruction through escalating criminal acts, something wonderful was unfolding around my farm. Her campaign of harassment had unintentionally sparked a regional movement in defense of agricultural rights. Families traveled from all over Montana to my stand, not just for the vegetables, but to stand with someone who had defied petty despotism. Veterans, small business owners, and rural families who had encountered their own bullies turned my farm into a weekend hotspot. The media coverage intensified as Karen's behavior grew more bizarre. Local newspapers began to publish weekly articles on the HOA farm fight, and Channel 7's investigative unit started to track Karen's activities as a case study in unchecked neighborhood power. Their footage of Karen on solo surveillance missions in her BMW, shouting at customers, went viral on social media platforms. Karen's high-priced lawyer finally cut ties, mentioning irreconcilable differences and client behavior incompatible with professional representation. Forced to represent herself, she submitted increasingly strange legal motions, seeking emergency injunctions and federal intervention to halt what she termed agricultural terrorism in suburban communities. Judge Morrison would later characterize her final legal submission as legally incoherent and professionally embarrassing. By the conclusion of the 5th month, Karen had gone from being an annoying neighbor to a federal criminal, all while inadvertently fostering a statewide movement for the protection of rural property. Her desperation had pushed her beyond any hope of return, generating sufficient evidence for multiple felony prosecutions. The mountain air was thick with the promise of imminent justice as her final confrontation with reality loomed. The Willowbrook Community Center was abuzz with a nervous atmosphere as residents arrived for Karen's emergency mandatory meeting. She had threatened legal action against anyone who failed to attend her ultimate presentation of evidence against my criminal agricultural operation. Over 80 people filled the room: residents, members of the media, and several new faces who would later be identified as federal investigators. The air was thick with the scent of coffee and anxiety as Karen arranged her presentation, looking like a prosecutor readying for the trial of a lifetime. I entered quietly, in full uniform, and chose a seat at the back, my badge reflecting the overhead fluorescent lights. Karen saw me, and her eyes lit up with what she perceived as a win. She had set up poster boards adorned with photographs, printed graphs, and bulging manila folders containing what she termed irrefutable proof of a criminal conspiracy. A hired cameraman set up his equipment to record what Karen was sure would be her crowning achievement. "Ladies and gentlemen," Karen began, her voice infused with that all-too-familiar condescending tone. "Tonight, we will uncover the agricultural terrorism that has spread through our community like a malignant disease. For too long, we have permitted criminal elements to function under the shield of corrupt law enforcement." For 20 agonizing minutes, Karen laid out her evidence with the self-assurance of someone who had completely detached from reality. She showed grainy photos of families buying tomatoes, asserting they were drug deals involving coded gestures. She played audio recordings of everyday conversations at the farm stand, claiming they held criminal messages in an agricultural code. She brandished bank statements displaying my legitimate farm earnings as evidence of money laundering through illegal agricultural sales. The audience became more and more uneasy as Karen's presentation exposed the extent of her surveillance and obsession. Residents exchanged troubled looks, realizing their neighbor had been documenting their every visit to my farm as if running some kind of suburban spy operation. "But here is the definitive proof," Karen proclaimed, reaching the peak of her speech and pointing directly at me. "Deputy Ezra Blackwood has been leveraging his law enforcement status to shield his criminal operation and intimidate upright citizens who dare to challenge authority. I have documented 17 instances of police corruption and abuse of power." She pivoted to address the crowd with a dramatic flourish. "I implore this community to perform a citizen's arrest on this corrupt deputy sheriff who has violated his oath and brought terror to our neighborhood." The room became completely still. No one stirred. Several residents appeared to be embarrassed for Karen as the full weight of her delusions became evident to everyone but her. It was at that moment that I rose and walked deliberately to the front, the sound of my boots resounding in the quiet room. "Good evening, everyone," I stated calmly, my voice resonating with the authority of 15 years in law enforcement. "I am Deputy Sheriff Ezra Blackwood, and I believe Ms. Peton has been anticipating my arrival." Karen's expression changed from triumphant to bewildered as I went on. "Ms. Peton, you have just given an outstanding demonstration of why you are being placed under arrest for embezzlement, fraud, filing false police reports, and managing an illegal organization." I presented the arrest warrant, observing her face shift from bewilderment to sheer horror. "Karen Peton, you have the right to remain silent." Gasps and shocked whispers filled the room as handcuffs materialized in my hands. "This is not possible," Karen shrieked, her voice filled with panic. "I am the victim here. I have legal authority. I am in charge of this HOA. You cannot arrest me." "Actually, ma'am, you never possessed any legal authority," I countered, fastening the handcuffs as Karen fought against the encroaching reality. "Your HOA was never lawfully incorporated. Every fee you gathered, every fine you levied, every official document you distributed was illegitimate." Detective Riley from the State Fraud Division came forward, holding federal warrants. "Mrs. Peton, you are also under federal arrest for wire fraud, mail fraud, and tax evasion, amounting to over $300,000 misappropriated from your neighbors." Karen's public collapse was total and catastrophic. She yelled about communist plots and police malfeasance, while her own videographer documented every second of her breakdown for future reference. This is a frame-up. You are all in on it. I was safeguarding property values. The crowd's response was immediate and cathartic. A wave of spontaneous applause erupted, with Mrs. Patterson rising to her feet to announce, "That woman has been a menace to this neighborhood for 5 years. Today, justice has finally been served." But the true surprise came when Detective Riley spoke to the astonished residents. "Ladies and gentlemen, you have all been the targets of systematic fraud. Every dollar you contributed in HOA dues was deposited into Ms. Peton's personal bank account. You have the right to full restitution plus damages." The feeling of justice was more gratifying than my grandmother's apple pie as Karen was escorted away in handcuffs, her protests of innocence fading into the parking lot. The local news provided live coverage of her perp walk, sharing her downfall with households across Montana who had been keenly following the story. As the community center cleared out, residents stayed behind to shake my hand and recount their own experiences with Karen's harassment. The mountain air outside smelled of pure freedom. 6 months later, justice was even more satisfying than I had imagined. Karen Peton was sentenced to 3 years in federal prison, ordered to pay $400,000 in restitution, and assigned 500 hours of community service, specifically to be performed on organic farms to foster an appreciation for the agricultural processes she spent years attempting to undermine. The judge's sense of poetic justice was not lost on anyone, particularly when Karen's lawyer contended that farm labor was cruel and unusual punishment. Even the bailiff had to suppress a grin. The residents of Willowbrook each received an average of $8,000 in reimbursement for the stolen fees, money that brought about unexpected positive changes in their lives. Families allocated their restitution for home renovations, children's education funds, and long-postponed holidays. The community established a legitimate HOA with proper incorporation, transparent financial practices, and, by a unanimous decision, a permanent bylaw to protect agricultural operations. Democracy had at last arrived in Willowbrook Estates. My farm transformed into something I had never envisioned. What began as a peaceful retreat for healing after my divorce blossomed into a vibrant community center that connected urban and rural families. The farm stand grew into a cooperative that showcased products from nearby agricultural businesses, fostering a market that benefited multiple local families while offering city dwellers genuine links to their food sources. The annual Blackwood Harvest Festival became the county's premier community gathering, drawing thousands of attendees who came to learn about sustainable agriculture, taste local goods, and see their children learn that vegetables do not simply materialize in supermarkets. Our inaugural festival generated $25,000 for agricultural scholarships, assisting rural students in obtaining degrees in sustainable farming and agricultural science. Personal joy found me in unforeseen ways as well. Dr. Sarah Martinez, the veterinarian who had begun visiting during the period of harassment, became my partner in every meaningful sense. Her knowledge of livestock and her contagious laugh revitalized both the farm's productivity and my own daily happiness. We are planning a wedding next spring, right here among the apple trees that Karen once sought to have cut down. The legal precedent set by our case brought about a revolution in property rights across Montana. The state legislature enacted the Rural Property Protection Act, which mandates HOA transparency, correct incorporation, and exemptions for agriculture. 3 other states have since passed similar legislation after rural advocacy groups used our success as a model to combat neighborhood despotism. Karen's criminal acts had inadvertently safeguarded thousands of farmers she would never know. But the most remarkable change occurred within Willowbrook itself. Freed from Karen's contrived conflicts, neighbors found that they genuinely liked one another. Property values rose as the community gained a reputation for harmony rather than strife. Block parties took the place of board meetings, shared gardens replaced petty grievances, and collaborative efforts replaced authoritarian dictates. Even Braden Peton managed to restore his reputation through radical honesty and ethical business conduct. After a public apology and restitution to former harassment victims, he now focuses on farm-friendly developments that aim to conserve rather than demolish existing agricultural lands. His company now prospers by promoting rural charm without destroying rural ways of life. The Montana Public Television documentary on our case ignited a national dialogue on HOA reform. The viewer response prompted further documentaries about other harassment victims who found the courage to resist after learning of our story. Karen's downfall had initiated a movement to defend property owners nationwide from similar mistreatment. Today, as I compose this with Buttercup grazing in the evening light and the scent of Sarah's homemade bread wafting from our kitchen, I am thankful for every single moment of Karen's harassment campaign. Her efforts to shatter my peace have given me the very life I never realized I desired: community bonds, meaningful work, enduring love, and the fulfillment of confronting bullying wherever it may arise. The mountain air is filled with the aroma of the ripening harvest and the sound of children's laughter from families participating in our educational programs. Sometimes, the most effective form of revenge is not to retaliate, but to construct something beautiful that benefits the entire community. Karen showed me that bullies expose their own frailties through their desperate need to dominate others. But she also showed me that everyday people possess extraordinary strength when they decline to be cowed by fabricated authority and fraudulent intimidation.